The sound of laughter echoed through the posh neighborhood, louder than the roar of the delivery van's engine. Jamal glanced at the address on his clipboard, then at the impressive mansion before him. It was his last delivery of the day, but something about this place made his stomach tighten. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the van, adjusting his hat. It was a hot day, and the sun beat down relentlessly. He grabbed the package from the back, a neatly wrapped box tied with a ribbon, and walked up the perfectly manicured lawn toward the front door. A group of well-dressed young people lounged on the lawn, their laughter carrying across the yard. Jamal noticed them out of the corner of his eye but kept his focus on his task. As he approached the door, he could hear snippets of their conversation, punctuated by bursts of laughter. His steps slowed, the weight of their attention pressing down on him. One of them, a tall young man with a sneer plastered on his face, nudged his friend and pointed at Jamal. "Hey, check it out," he said, his voice loud enough for Jamal to hear. "Looks like the delivery guy's here." Jamal's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. He forced himself to keep walking, his eyes on the door. He was almost there when another voice piped up, mocking and cruel. "Nice hat," it said, dripping with sarcasm. Jamal ignored them, reaching the door and pressing the doorbell. As he waited, he could feel their eyes on him, could hear their whispers and snickers. He adjusted his hat again, wiping sweat from his brow. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman with a kind smile stood there. "Delivery for Mrs. Johnson," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Oh, thank you," the woman said, taking the package from him. "Just a moment, let me get you a tip." As she turned to go inside, Jamal heard another voice from the group, louder this time. "Hey, why don't you take off that hat? Let's see what you're hiding under there." Jamal clenched his teeth. He could feel the humiliation burning inside him. But he couldn't afford to lose this job. He took off his hat, wiping his brow again, and as he did, one of the boys shouted, "Hey, look! He thinks he's people now." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He looked over at the group, his eyes meeting theirs. They laughed harder, pointing and jeering. Jamal felt a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside him, but he kept his face impassive. The woman returned with a few bills, pressing them into Jamal's hand. "Thank you so much," she said warmly. "Have a great day." Jamal nodded, forcing a smile. "You too, ma'am," he said, turning away quickly. He walked back to his van, the laughter still ringing in his ears. He climbed in, slamming the door shut, and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the group still laughing, their faces twisted with cruel amusement. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, the mansion growing smaller in his rearview mirror. As he drove, the events replayed in his mind, each word and laugh echoing louder. He tried to shake it off, to focus on the road, but it was no use. Memories from his past surfaced, times when he had faced similar treatment. Each incident added to the heavy burden he carried. Jamal stopped at a red light, his mind racing. He thought about his family, about his friends. They all had their own stories, their own scars. He knew he wasn't alone, but in that moment, the weight of his experiences felt crushing. When the light turned green, Jamal drove to a local diner, a favorite spot where he often met up with friends after work. He parked the van and walked inside, the familiar bell above the door ringing as he entered. The cool air and the smell of coffee and fried food greeted him, offering a small comfort. "Jamal." "Over here," a voice called from a corner booth. Jamal looked over and saw his friend Marcus waving him over. Jamal made his way to the booth, sliding in opposite Marcus. "Hey, man," he said, trying to muster a smile. Marcus took one look at Jamal's face and frowned. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jamal sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's nothing. Just some rich kids being jerks." "Tell me what happened," Marcus insisted, his eyes serious. Jamal hesitated, but then the words came tumbling out. He told Marcus about the delivery, the mocking, the laughter. As he spoke, the anger and humiliation he had been holding back came to the surface. Marcus listened, his expression growing darker with each word. When Jamal finished, Marcus shook his head. "Man, that's messed up. You shouldn't have to deal with that." "I know," Jamal said, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "But what can I do? It's not like I can change their minds." "Maybe not," Marcus said slowly. "But you can show them that what they did was wrong. Make them see the harm they've caused." Jamal looked at his friend, seeing the determination in his eyes. He knew Marcus was right. He couldn't just let this go. He had to do something, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. "Yeah," Jamal said, his voice firm. "You're right. I can't just let this slide." Marcus nodded. "We'll figure something out. We'll make them see." As they talked, a plan began to form in Jamal's mind. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew he had to try. For now, though, he focused on the company of his friend, the warmth of the diner, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Jamal drove away from the diner, the conversation with Marcus replaying in his mind. The streets were quieter now, the sun beginning to set and casting long shadows across the pavement. He tried to push the day's events to the back of his mind, but the mocking voices of those young men echoed persistently. He pulled into the driveway of his modest home, a small but well-kept house in a close-knit neighborhood. The familiarity of his surroundings brought a small measure of comfort. As he stepped out of the van, he saw his neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, tending to her flower garden. "Evening, Jamal," she called, a warm smile on her face. "How was your day?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "It was all right, Mrs. Wilson. How about yours?" "Oh, you know, same old, same old. These flowers keep me busy," she said with a chuckle. "Have a good night, dear." "Thanks, you too," Jamal replied, heading inside. The house was quiet. Jamal's wife, Rachel, wouldn't be home for another hour, and their 2 children were at a friend's house. He set his keys on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. His thoughts drifted back to the incident at the mansion. He remembered the look on the young men's faces, the way they laughed as if he were nothing more than a source of amusement. It wasn't the first time he had faced such cruelty, but each time it cut just as deep. He closed his eyes, memories from his childhood surfacing unbidden. He remembered being the only black kid in his class, the way the other children would exclude him from their games, call him names. He remembered the teachers who would turn a blind eye, the neighbors who would whisper behind his family's back. Jamal shook his head, trying to dispel the memories. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. He thought about what Marcus had said, about making those young men see the harm they had caused. But how? The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. Rachel walked in, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, honey," she said, crossing the room to give him a hug. "How was your day?" Jamal hugged her back, the familiar scent of her perfume bringing him comfort. "It was rough," he admitted. Rachel pulled back, concern in her eyes. "What happened?" Jamal sighed, leading her to the couch. As they sat down, he recounted the day's events, the humiliation he felt, the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. Rachel listened quietly, her hand resting on his. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "No one should be treated that way." "I know," Jamal said, his voice heavy. "But it happens. More often than it should." Rachel nodded, a determined look crossing her face. "We need to do something about it. We can't let them get away with this." Jamal looked at his wife, seeing the fire in her eyes. It gave him strength. "Marcus and I talked about it. We're going to come up with a plan, something to show them that what they did was wrong." Rachel squeezed his hand. "I'll help in any way I can." We'll figure this out together. Later that night, after the kids were home and tucked into bed, Jamal sat in his small home office, staring at his computer screen. He started by researching the young men who had mocked him. It didn't take long to find them. Their social media profiles were filled with pictures of parties, expensive cars, and vacations in exotic locations. Jamal's frustration grew as he scrolled through their posts, each one a reminder of the privilege they took for granted. But he also found something useful. They all attended the same prestigious local university. An idea began to form in his mind. The next morning, Jamal called Marcus and shared his plan. "We need to do something that will get their attention, make them realize the impact of their actions," he said. "I'm with you," Marcus replied. "What do you have in mind?" "A peaceful demonstration," Jamal said. "We'll get the community involved, show them that we stand together against this kind of behavior." Marcus agreed, and they spent the next few days reaching out to friends, family, and community leaders. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were eager to stand up against the injustice Jamal had faced, to show their support. Jamal also wrote a letter to the university's dean, explaining what had happened and outlining their plan for the demonstration. He hoped that by bringing the issue to the university's attention, they could spark a broader conversation about respect and dignity. In the evenings, Jamal and Rachel worked together, creating signs and flyers for the demonstration. Their children helped too, coloring in the posters with messages of unity and love. It became a family effort, each of them contributing in their own way. One night, as they sat around the kitchen table, Rachel looked at Jamal and said, "I'm proud of you. You're turning something painful into something powerful." Jamal smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I couldn't do it without you," he said. "Without all of you." The day of the demonstration arrived, and Jamal felt a mix of nervousness and determination. They gathered outside the university, a diverse group of people united by a common cause. Jamal looked around, seeing friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard about the incident and wanted to show their support. The local media had picked up the story, and reporters were there, interviewing participants and capturing the event. Jamal stood at the front of the crowd, holding a sign that read "Respect and Dignity for All." As he looked at the faces around him, he felt a surge of hope. The dean of the university approached Jamal, a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Davis, I want to apologize on behalf of the university. We take this matter very seriously and will be addressing it immediately." Jamal nodded, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you. We just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As they spoke, the young men who had mocked Jamal appeared, looking uncomfortable and unsure. They were confronted by the weight of the situation, the eyes of the crowd upon them. It was a powerful moment, one that Jamal hoped would lead to real change. That night, as Jamal and his family sat down for dinner, he felt a sense of accomplishment. They had taken a stand, and while there was still much work to be done, they had made their voices heard. Jamal looked at his children, seeing the future in their eyes, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope. They were making a difference, one step at a time. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over Jamal's small home office. He sat at his desk, sipping his coffee and staring at the notes scattered across the surface. Today was the day to finalize the plans for the demonstration, and the weight of responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders. But he felt a determination burning within him, fueled by the support of his community and the love of his family. Jamal's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Marcus. "Hey, man," Marcus said when Jamal answered. "You ready for today?" "Yeah, I've been up since dawn, going over everything," Jamal replied. "I think we've got a solid plan." "Good. We need to make sure this goes off without a hitch. The media's going to be there, and we need to show them and those kids that we mean business." Jamal nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. "Absolutely. I'll see you at the community center in an hour." After hanging up, Jamal gathered his notes and made his way to the kitchen, where Rachel was preparing breakfast. The smell of pancakes and bacon filled the air, and their children, Maya and Jordan, sat at the table, chattering excitedly about the day ahead. "Morning, everyone," Jamal said, kissing Rachel on the cheek. "Morning, Daddy." Maya and Jordan chorused, their faces lighting up. Rachel looked at him, a question in her eyes. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," Jamal said with a smile. "Nervous, but ready." Rachel squeezed his hand. "You've got this. We all believe in you." Jamal felt a surge of gratitude. "Thanks. I couldn't do this without you all." After breakfast, Jamal and his family drove to the community center, where a group of friends and supporters had gathered to help with the final preparations. The air was filled with a sense of purpose and anticipation. Posters and signs were being painted, each one carrying messages of unity, respect, and justice. Marcus greeted Jamal with a firm handshake. "We're almost ready. The flyers are printed, and we've got a schedule for the speakers." "Great," Jamal said, looking around at the bustling activity. "This is really happening." Marcus clapped him on the back. "You've done a great job, man. We're all behind you." Jamal spent the next few hours coordinating with volunteers, ensuring everything was in place. He felt a sense of camaraderie and solidarity as people from all walks of life came together for a common cause. The community's strength gave him hope and bolstered his resolve. As the demonstration time approached, the crowd began to swell. Families, students, and local activists gathered, holding their signs high and chanting slogans of peace and equality. The media arrived, setting up cameras and interviewing participants. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a shared determination to make a difference. Jamal took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. He felt a moment of nervousness, but then he saw Rachel and the kids in the front row, their faces filled with pride and support. "Thank you all for being here today," Jamal began, his voice steady. "We're here to stand up against hate and discrimination, to demand respect and dignity for everyone, no matter their race or background." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jamal continued. "What happened to me was just one example of the prejudice and injustice that many people face every day. But today, we're showing that we won't stand for it. We're here to make our voices heard, to call for change." As Jamal spoke, he saw the young men who had mocked him standing at the edge of the crowd. Their expressions were a mix of discomfort and shame. Jamal hoped that seeing the outpouring of support and solidarity would make them realize the impact of their actions. After Jamal, several other speakers took the stage, each sharing their own experiences and calling for unity. The crowd listened intently, their resolve growing with each story. The demonstration was a powerful display of community strength and resilience, a testament to the power of standing together. When the event concluded, the dean of the university approached Jamal. "Mr. Davis, I want to thank you for bringing this issue to our attention. We are committed to addressing it and fostering a more inclusive environment." Jamal shook his hand. "Thank you, Dean Rogers. I appreciate your support. It's important that we work together to make real change." As the crowd began to disperse, Jamal felt a sense of accomplishment. The demonstration had been a success, and he hoped it would be the first step toward a more inclusive and respectful community. That evening, Jamal and his family returned home, exhausted but exhilarated. They sat around the dinner table, reflecting on the day's events. "I'm so proud of you, Daddy," Maya said, her eyes shining. "Me too," Jordan added, nodding vigorously. Jamal smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, kids. Today was just the beginning. We're going to keep fighting for what's right." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with love and admiration. "You were amazing today. You inspired so many people." Jamal took her hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you all. We're in this together." As the days passed, the impact of the demonstration began to ripple through the community. Conversations about respect and equality became more frequent, and people started to challenge discriminatory behavior whenever they saw it. The young men who had mocked Jamal reached out to him, offering sincere apologies and expressing a desire to learn and grow from their mistakes. Jamal accepted their apologies, hoping that their experiences would lead them to become better, more compassionate individuals. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose. Each day, he continued his work, both as a delivery man and as an advocate for justice. He spoke at schools and community centers, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up against hate. And through it all, he remained grounded by the love and support of his family. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed far away, Jamal would reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He knew there was still much work to be done, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. Together, they would keep pushing for a better, more just world, one step at a time. Jamal sat in his living room, the evening news playing softly in the background. The demonstration had been a week ago, but the impact was still being felt throughout the community. He had been invited to speak at several local events, and the university had announced new initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion. Jamal felt a sense of accomplishment, but he knew there was more work to be done. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Rachel opened it to find Marcus standing there, a serious expression on his face. "Hey, Jamal," Marcus said, stepping inside. "You got a minute?" "Of course," Jamal replied, motioning for him to sit down. "What's up?" Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped together. "I've been thinking a lot about those kids. The ones who mocked you. I think we need to talk to them, face to face." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll be willing to meet?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "But I think it's worth a try. They need to understand the impact of their actions, and maybe hearing it directly from you will make a difference." Jamal considered this for a moment. Confronting those young men wasn't something he relished, but he knew Marcus had a point. If they were truly going to change, they needed to see the real consequences of their behavior. "All right," Jamal said finally. "Let's do it. How do we set it up?" "I've got a friend who works at the university," Marcus explained. "He can help arrange a meeting. I'll reach out to him and see what we can do." A few days later, Jamal received a call from Marcus. "It's all set," Marcus said. "The deans agreed to mediate a meeting between you and those kids. It'll be tomorrow afternoon at the university." Jamal felt a mix of anxiety and determination. "Thanks, Marcus. I'll be there." The next day, Jamal drove to the university, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say. He parked and walked to the administration building, where Marcus was waiting for him. "You ready?" Marcus asked, his eyes serious. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jamal replied, taking a deep breath. They entered the building and were led to a conference room by the dean. Inside, the young men who had mocked Jamal were seated around a table, looking uncomfortable. The dean greeted Jamal and Marcus, then took his place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," the dean began. "We're here today to have an honest and respectful conversation about what happened. Jamal, would you like to start?" Jamal nodded, his gaze steady. "I want to thank you all for being here. I know this isn't easy, but it's important. What happened that day affected me deeply. It wasn't just about the words you said, but what they represented. They reminded me of all the times I've been judged and discriminated against because of the color of my skin." The room was silent, the young men avoiding Jamal's eyes. He continued, his voice steady but emotional. "When you laughed at me, you weren't just laughing at a delivery man. You were laughing at every struggle, every humiliation I've faced. You reduced me to a stereotype, and that hurt more than you can imagine." One of the young men, the tall one who had sneered at Jamal, finally looked up. His face was pale, and he seemed genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how much it would hurt you. We were just messing around, but that's no excuse." Jamal appreciated the apology, but he wasn't finished. "I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to help you understand that your actions have consequences. Words have power, and they can cause real harm. I hope you'll think about that the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance." Another young man spoke up, his voice shaky. "We've talked a lot about what happened since the demonstration. It really opened our eyes. We've started attending diversity training sessions, and we're trying to educate ourselves." Jamal felt a glimmer of hope. "That's good to hear. Education is a big part of change. But it's also about empathy and respect. You need to see people for who they are, not just what they look like." The dean nodded in agreement. "This is a learning opportunity for all of us. We must strive to create a community where everyone feels valued and respected." The conversation continued for another hour, with Jamal sharing more about his experiences and the young men asking questions and expressing their regret. It was a difficult but necessary dialogue, and by the end, Jamal felt a sense of closure. As they left the conference room, the tall young man approached Jamal. "Thank you for talking to us," he said, his voice sincere. "I know we have a lot to learn, but we're committed to doing better." Jamal shook his hand. "I appreciate that. Just remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey, and it's about making better choices every day." On the drive home, Jamal reflected on the meeting. It had been emotionally draining, but he felt it had been worth it. He hoped that by confronting those young men, he had planted a seed of understanding and empathy that would grow over time. That evening, as Jamal sat with his family, he shared the day's events. Rachel listened intently, her eyes filled with pride. "You did a brave thing today," she said. "You helped them see a different perspective." "I hope so," Jamal replied. "I just want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." Maya and Jordan, who had been listening quietly, looked at their father with wide eyes. "Daddy, you're like a superhero," Jordan said, his voice filled with awe. Jamal chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Not quite, buddy. I'm just trying to make the world a little better, one step at a time." As the night grew darker and the house grew quiet, Jamal felt a sense of peace. He knew the road ahead was still long, but he was committed to walking it. With his family by his side and his community behind him, he believed they could create a world where everyone was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. The weeks following the confrontation at the university were a whirlwind for Jamal. News of the meeting and the demonstration had spread throughout the community, sparking conversations about race, respect, and empathy. Jamal found himself in demand as a speaker at schools, community centers, and local organizations. His story had become a catalyst for change, and he embraced the opportunity to make a difference. One evening, as Jamal was preparing for another speaking engagement, Rachel walked into the room, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You've been doing amazing work, honey," she said, sitting beside him. "But I've been thinking, maybe it's time for something bigger." Jamal looked at her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Rachel took his hand. "You've been inspiring people with your story, but what if you could reach even more? What if you started a foundation, something dedicated to promoting equality and understanding?" Jamal considered this. The idea was daunting, but also exciting. A foundation. That could really make a difference. "I know it's a big step," Rachel said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "But I believe in you. We all do. And I think the community would support it." Jamal felt a surge of determination. "All right. Let's do it. Let's start a foundation." Over the next few months, Jamal and Rachel worked tirelessly to establish the foundation. They reached out to friends, family, and community leaders, gaining support and funding. The foundation, named Voices for Unity, aimed to provide educational programs, scholarships, and community initiatives to promote understanding and respect. The launch event for the foundation was held at the community center. It was a warm, sunny day, and the atmosphere was filled with excitement and hope. Jamal stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd of supporters. His family, friends, and even some of the young men from the university were there, their faces reflecting a shared sense of purpose. "Thank you all for being here," Jamal began, his voice steady but emotional. "Today marks the beginning of a new journey. Voices for Unity is more than just a foundation, it's a movement. A movement towards a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jamal continued. "This foundation is about education, empathy, and action. We're here to listen, to learn, and to grow together. It's about creating a future where no one has to experience the pain of discrimination." Jamal spoke about his own experiences, about the journey that had led him to this moment. He talked about the importance of standing together, of speaking out against injustice, and of working towards a common goal. The crowd was captivated, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and determination. After the speeches, the event turned into a celebration. There were booths with information about the Foundation's programs, activities for children, and tables laden with food. Jamal mingled with the crowd, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew this was just the beginning, but it was a strong start. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Jamal found himself standing with the young men from the university. They looked different now, more mature and thoughtful. The tall one, who had sneered at him that day, stepped forward. "Jamal," he began, his voice earnest, "we wanted to thank you for giving us a chance to learn and grow. We've been volunteering at local community centers, trying to make a positive impact. You inspired us to be better." Jamal felt a swell of pride and gratitude. "I'm glad to hear that. It takes courage to change and to admit when you're wrong. I'm proud of you guys." The young men nodded, their faces reflecting genuine respect. Jamal knew that this was what it was all about, changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. Later that night, after the event had ended and the crowd had dispersed, Jamal stood on the steps of the community center, looking out at the quiet street. Rachel joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. "You started something incredible." Jamal smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "We did it. This is just the beginning, but it feels right. It feels like we're making a real difference." Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you. And I know our kids are too." Jamal looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of connection to something bigger than himself. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You and the kids, and everyone who believed in us."